I'll start out and just say David Kanietakeron Fadden can't be here tonight. If he were, he would probably start this whole event with a traditional Thanksgiving address, which folks have been doing for a long time, and it's such a great idea. It's when people come together in large numbers with all their different agendas and personalities to find some common ground before you start doing what you're doing. And in this case, it's thanking the natural world for sustaining us. So if you come to another one of our talks, probably later in the coming year or so, I'm sure you'll get to hear that from Dave. So I'm going to skip right ahead then. Let's say thank you to the natural world for taking care of us. And let's see if I can get this to work. Yep. There we go. So we'll start with this theme of, what is the history of the Adirondacks? And, this wonderful organization of Historic Saranac Lake is dedicated to telling that story. And it's a wonderful resource. If you haven't visited their wiki online, you can find all kinds of amazing, really important stuff. So this is part of their narrative now too, but of course, I'm sure you know, as residents here, the traditional narrative for the last century or more has been, you come to the Adirondacks, it's about lumberjacks in red checked shirts, and great camps and trains and guides and things like that. And that is absolutely part of the story. It's a big part of our heritage, but there's much more to that. The main place, let's see, I'm going to keep flipping. Should I say next or something? Yeah. And, yeah. Oh, I know why it's probably not on. That might be why. So this is one of the main resources. When I moved up here half a century ago, people said, oh, read Donaldson, he'll tell you, everything you need to know. It's a 2-volume book. How many of you have read Donaldson stuff? That's kind of the go-to place. So even if you haven't read it, you've probably heard what's in there, right? Just a little context on that. He wrote it about 100 years ago. He was not a historian, he was a banker. But people said we need a history book for the area, so he put it together as best he could. But there are major flaws in it, including major omissions and other flaws, so which we won't get into that much. But the bottom line is people like Donaldson and people since then have said that Native folks did not live up here. That's what I heard all through the years when I first moved up here, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this too. And okay, well, why wouldn't they live here? Well, there's a list of standard reasons that you'll get if you ask local folks on the street. So here are 4 of the ones that I collected the most often. One is, why didn't they live up here? Because the climate's too brutal, can't handle it. It's too hard to grow crops up here. They didn't live up here because there was nothing here for them. Or they were only passing through. So they weren't really here, they were just in transit or something like that. So there are a lot of reasons why this is important. One is it's, of course, painful to hear that if you are of Indigenous descent, to say that you don't have a pass here. But there were some practical implications of this too that happened when traditional folks lost their rights to be on the land like they traditionally were, and it was that because they weren't using it, officially designated as empty land, the state took it. Right? So there have been practical consequences of this too. Well, it's, as you're going to see, it's not correct. Right? So some people have been pushing back against that narrative for a very long time, and the Fadden family has been at the forefront of that up here in the Adirondacks, and of course other folks too. But I give credit to people like Ray Kanietakeron Fadden, like we just heard, that basically started the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center in the 1950s and did a lot of outreach and training and Akwesasne and other places too. So he was, finding items from people who had lived here through the centuries and built the museum by hand in the form of a longhouse and was collecting. So here's this amazingly beautiful pot, if you've ever been to the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. They have that in a corner there. It was found in that rock shelter at Silver Lake Mountain by a deer hunter. And so it's like, well, if they weren't here, why do they have that? So they've been pushing back, and now, of course, Ray has long since passed. Then the museum was under the management, you say, of John Fadden. He is now passed, and so Dave is now the director of the museum. And my relationship with Dave started partly because I knew Ray, and then I knew John, and a lot of you did too. But also, about 10 years ago, we had a special connection that started with joint projects, and that was my parents had just turned 80. They came up here. I wanted to show them around and wine and dine them, and I thought, well, they'd have fun at the center, so we went there. And there in the corner on the floor was a dugout canoe. And my father asked John, who was there, he said, oh, that's really nice. How old is that? And John said, I don't know. We don't have the funds to do carbon-14 dating and things like that. So my father turned to me and he said, well, you're doing lake research and you do carbon-14 dating. Why don't you date it for him? Okay. It's legitimate. It came from a lake, right? I'm studying lakes. So, okay. And then, so then John turned to Dave and said, hey, Dave, Curt's going to work in this dugout canoe. Why don't you help him? And said, okay. So that's how it started. So here we are taking a sample of wood from inside there. We got it carbon dated. It came out to not all that old. It's probably about 300 years old, something like that. But that was a project we did. And of course we got hooked and we both admitted we wished it had been a lot older than that. And so we kept going. And we basically have now dated every known potentially old dugout canoe in the Adirondacks. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So we started out that way, but then we've been collaborating afterwards too, and you'll see the results of that as we go along. So here's one of the things of sort of getting into the human story for me from this lake research. So now I'm working on dugouts with Dave, and we're trying to figure out, okay, if it's 300 years old, who made it? So we start looking into that. The story turns out, you know, people of all cultures were using these hollowed out logs for boats at the time. Here's a Winslow Homer painting from the Adirondacks called The Trapper. You know, an Anglo-European person using it too. So how do we tell? So then we start self-educating on all of this and find out, well, one way you can tell is look at the tools that were used. And pretty much everybody was using metal tools that are sharp, that leave sharp cut marks like that around 300 years ago. But if you find blunt implement stuff, it's probably stone tools, and that's from before the white folks showed up. So we're looking into that. And then we met Tim Messner, an archaeologist at SUNY Potsdam, who's doing a lot of these traditional processes, including building dugout canoes with his own students. So basically what you would do is burn the log, char it, and then pound on it with the stone tools. You can get the charcoal out and also pulverize it a bit and then burn it some more. And it takes about a month to do something like that. And it worked when they did it. So we're learning, we're connecting with other folks as we go along and realizing it's wicked cool. So finally, through word of mouth, help from folks at Adirondack Light and elsewhere, we were able to get access to a big old dugout canoe that was in someone's home down near Jay. And we found out that there are no sharp cut marks on it. It's all dark and charred. And when we carbon dated it, it's the oldest one we know of so far. So it's about 500 years old. And that's about right. That's right before there were a lot of Europeans showing up in the area. So that's almost certainly made by Indigenous folks at Twin Ponds, which is halfway between here and Malone, basically. Buried in a peat deposit. So, and it's massive. 18 feet long, it'd be like from here to the wall. So yeah, pretty cool. Okay, so the learning curve continues over the last more than a decade. So here's Tim Messner himself. He invited me and Carrie to accompany him on an excavation he was doing with his archaeology students at Long Lake. So we go to this place in a person's yard who gave permission. First thing we saw was a pit dug out, maybe the size of this screen like that, and there are these little stones down in there. They're about the size of an apple on the bottom there. And Tim's all excited. He says, wow, that's FCR. I said, oh yeah, what's that? Fire cracked rock. Okay, he said, it's a hearth. For me, a hearth is, you know, a fireplace, you know, and all that. I said, no, this was a fire pit. And those were stones in somebody's fire. And what they used to do in the old days was have a birch bark container or an animal skin container or something like that you put your food in, maybe a stew or something. You heat these rocks up red hot, and then you drop them in, and it boils and cooks the food. So that was before you had metal pots to put on the fire and stuff like that. So this was evidence of people camping out there. So this was shortly after hooking up with Dave at the museum, and so I said, well, how old do you think it is? I don't know, I don't have any dates, funds for carbon dating. He said, but you know, this dark stuff around here, that's charcoal from the fire, so that could actually be dated. So you know what happened? It's 1,000 years old. So while the Vikings were settling Greenland and Iceland, there were people having a cookout on Long Lake. So what I'm going to do with this is drag you progressively farther back in time, the things that have been found here, and then talk about it. So the Fulton chain of lakes is well known for a lot of items. This is from a personal collection of somebody who lives in that area. And you can identify the ages of these, not by carbon dating, but by actually just looking at the style. And archaeologists have a time scale mapped out for the different styles, having dated them elsewhere. So Tim helped identify these. They're 5,000 years old. That's the time of the pyramids in Egypt. And Tupper Lake, when they dropped the level of the lake to work on the dam, the shoreline was exposed. Items that had washed out of shoreline banks were exposed, and an archaeological team did a brief survey of the area, and they found items from the entire thousands of years, including this one. That's the style of the point here. It's got a little groove in here. That's characteristic of people who lived about 12,000 years ago. Well, my kind of work had to do with the lakes and the history of the lakes, and from what we were finding from taking sediment cores down through the lakes, was that the lakes around here emerged from under the ice about 13 to 12,000 years old. So that means people were here as long as they could have been. This kind of item here was a projectile point used with an atlatl, a little throwing stick, and it'd be a dart or a little spear that would be used probably for caribou hunting. That's what people would have done at that time. So, looking at, this is a picture I took 12,000 years ago at campus. But in a way it kind of is. The sediment cores we look at have pollen grains in them. You can tell what kind of plants there were and things like that. So back then, the landscape had just emerged from the ice sheet. It was like northern Canada, Arctic Canada. So it was mosses and grasses and little shrubs and things like that. It's called tundra, right? Well, there was no forest then. There were maybe some trees, a few scraggly birches and a few spruces and things, but basically it's open tundra. So that means, since people were here hunting caribou, we don't know if we had mastodons or mammoths. There were still some around in New York State at that time. They might have been here. But anyway, this brought to mind an interesting statement from a song that John Denver made popular called Country Roads. It says, life is old there, older than the trees. It's true here. People have been here longer than the forests, older than the trees. It's quite a different perspective on our story from they didn't live here at all. Right? The trees are recent arrivals compared to people. So I'll close this part of the talk with just a summary. So I kept a running tab for the last decade or so of every single place in the park, in the uplands, where people weren't supposed to be, where somebody found something, a piece of pottery, even as simple as a little flake of chert or flint, you could call it. This kind of mineral does not occur naturally up here in the mountains. Here's the Adirondacks, there's Lake Champlain, there's the St. Lawrence, there's Lake Ontario, there's Albany. These dots, every red dot is where something was found, including, students and I, or Terry and I, or other people and I. You find us on our hands and knees at a DPC campsite on, Middle Saranac Lake, pawing through the needles, and you'll find that from people who are flaking their tools, sharpening them, things like that, in the same places we like to be today, for the same reasons. So anywhere something was found, that's more than 3 dozen places. So, and they cover the last 12,000 years. So, yeah, pretty conclusive, right? So we can throw numbers around, and that works. But you can also try to bring it into your gut level awareness, too, of what our story is by other techniques. So I tried this one here to try to visualize what 12,000 years worth of human lives would look like. So maybe I'll feel it more. So I tried this. I made little stick figures. And let's say that's an average lifetime. And just rounding it up for easy to say a 50-year lifetime on average, whatever. Okay, so for ancient history, traditionally, that we've been hearing around here, is it'd be about 5 human lifetimes to date back to the American Revolution, which is when European folks were mainly starting to show up around here. That's the history of the Adirondacks, according to the traditional narrative you hear in Donaldson or something like that. Here's what it really was. It's 12,000 years of lifetimes. They all had names, they all had births, lives, and deaths, triumphs and tragedies, and they were all Adirondackers that we never heard, acknowledged in the traditional narrative around here. So yeah, let's keep going here. I'm gonna deconstruct the list of why they didn't live here. First we deconstructed that they didn't live here. Now we're gonna deconstruct the why. It's cognitive dissonance. It doesn't make sense when you think about it, right? Really, of course they lived here. Well, they did, but the arguments against it don't really make sense. Okay, climates are too brutal for indigenous folks. I mean, people lived here all the way up to the Arctic and still do. Why? And they couldn't live here? That doesn't make sense. And other places too, in the mountains out west and in New England and all these places, like, of course it wasn't too brutal for them. I mean, their ancestors, we go by the archaeological narrative, came over from where? Siberia? We also have eyewitness accounts. Here's one from a missionary, Jesuit missionary, Isaac Job. He was held captive by Haudenosaunee folks in the 1600s, and they took him in a winter camp up into the Adirondacks with old men and women and children in the brutal climate that was too terrible for them. So we do have an eyewitness account. The thing about them too being, you can't grow crops in the Adirondacks. It's sometimes said by people who I know for sure have driven by the Tuckers bringing Adirondack corn maze in Gabriel's. You can ask the Tuckers whether you can grow crops in the Adirondacks or not, right? Nothing here for them? Well, I mean, there's plenty of stuff to make homes and plenty of space for that. There are maple trees. The indigenous folks of the North Country invented maple syrup, sap harvesting and stuff like that. So that's all up here. There are fish year-round, even through the ice. Drill a hole in the ice or chop a hole in the ice, and you have fresh fish all year-round. So there's there, and then of course the critters are here. So of course there's everything you need. Why wouldn't they live here, right? The one you hear the most is that they didn't really live here because they were only passing through. What you really have there, we won't dwell on it too much, but it has to do with dwelling. It's different cultural worldviews of what it means to live somewhere. Right? In the traditional narrative, you only live there if you sat down and built a big old building and made a city or something like that. But what if that's not your lifestyle? What if you move from place to place to where the food is? Then you live in an entire region. And that's what our ancestors did all over the planet for most of human history, right? You lived in a region, not in a town, right? And there's evidence of people coming here repeatedly and spending a long time period like this. Dugout canoe, there was actually 2 500-year-old dugout canoes from Twin Ponds. The pond is small. It's got an outlet, but it's a very small stream. So you couldn't have used these big dugouts on the little stream. They were made to be used there. So if you're just rushing through the mountains to get somewhere, you don't then sit there for a month chopping a dugout and then paddle across this little pond and abandon it, right? This is for people who came up there frequently. And also pottery, like Ray Fadden had the pot, and people have found pottery all over the region. Traditionally, women were the folks in Haudenosaunee society and Abenaki society and others too that made the pottery. So that suggested the presence of women, not just a few guys running along for various reasons. It suggests family life that you would have pottery. Plus, think of, some of these pots are like this big. Are you going to like travel through the Adirondacks carrying this fragile thing around? So some people like John Fadden suggested these are in places like the rock shelter on Silver Lake Mountain. Maybe just you leave it there partly because it's hard to carry, and partly to let people know this rock shelter is occupied. You say this is our place. There's our pot still sitting there. Okay, so I'm going to transition here in a minute to the book, but I do want to acknowledge that someone else has challenged the myth in print, and it's important to do books. I got to say, because if there's something psychological about it, when Dave and I and Tim Messner and I would have conversations on the street surveying people, and then we'd push back a little bit saying that they couldn't live here. They say, well, it's got to be true because I read it. It was in a book. Okay, leave me in a book. Turns out Melissa Otis has done a book, and it's wonderful, and I highly recommend it. She's a great scholar. Her focus was on the last 300, 500 years on there. It's very well documented, showing that there were people here. And maybe one of the take-homes of her work that fits what we're doing right now is why did so many people of European descent writing, when they're writing, why did they think there weren't folks up here? There were some good reasons. A lot of them were dead. In the 1600s, there were massive plagues that you may have heard about maybe in your history class, but they were on par or worse than the Black Death in Europe, like 90% mortality. So a lot of people were dead. It was from diseases the Europeans brought over. There was massive warfare because of the Europeans and then other indigenous folks fighting among themselves. And so the other thing is also, Melissa makes the case that the Adirondacks were a place of refuge for people, displaced and traumatized, and they didn't want you to know they were here. Right? So anyway, there are lots of reasons why the last 500 years of eyewitness accounts is actually the worst possible time to ask the question of if people live here. So that's what we're doing with this really old stuff. Okay, so we've brought this home to our community at Paul Smith's as well, and I'm sure a lot of folks are doing it in other places, but we're updating and enriching our own narrative of what Paul Smith's College is. And of course, I'm sure you know, Paul and Lydia Smith started that place as a hotel in the 1800s, and so I've been teaching there for a long time, and Carrie and I lived on the campus, and one day in the midst of all this stuff, we went out on this. It's called Picnic Point because of the hotel days. Guests would have picnics out there. Actually, Trudeau started there, right? He was at Paul Smith's Hotel. Right? So we're here. I'm sitting right here looking across the lake, and some students had a canoe out there. So I'm here fantasizing like, oh, this could be 10,000 years ago. Wouldn't that be so nice? And at that distance, in my lousy eyes, it could well be any time. And then I hear this noise behind me, and then I hear Carrie's voice, and she says, I think I found something. So she was, navigating around in here, and that's what she had. We got goosebumps. Oh my gosh. So yeah, that's several thousand years old. At minimum, it's centuries old, based on the style there. So now we're on our hands and knees looking through the pine needles, and I found another piece, and then found another piece, and they fit together. And this is a groove at the base. There's the point, there's the base. That is very much like that one at Tupper Lake. So we contacted the State Museum in Albany, and John Wolfrop's the expert on that time period, and sent him photos and all, and he said it looks like it's an unfinished fluted point, 10,000, 12,000 years old. Right there on the point. Right there, which is where we like to sit and do what we do. So you'll find pistachio shells and all kinds of things sitting there among the remains of what people have been doing there for 10,000, 12,000 years. Amazing. So our heritage at Paul Smith's is much richer than we thought it was. And we're appreciative of it. It's really great. There were other hints, then digging through any source of history I could find. There's James Wardner, a hotelier in Rainbow Lake, wrote in his diary that he claims he told Paul Smith to build his hotel on that very spot. May or may not be true, but what he did mention in passing was he told him to build it on the lake about where the Indians are camping, is what he said. Well, there you go. There were people there. We already know because of the items we found, but here's a description. So basically, an encampment was displaced for the hotel, which now became the college, where I'm employed in some connected too. So in keeping with that knowledge, we try to learn as much as we can of our history, and it turns out in the late 1800s, Mitchell Sabattis, he's an Abenaki guide, well-known Abenaki guide, was interviewed. And they asked Sabattis, so what did your dad, Captain Peter Sabattis, what did people like him call that lake before Paul Smith showed up? He said, oh, we call it Akwesasne Lake. Actually, because he's Abenaki, his family was displaced during the fighting. I think he might have been at Adirondack or somewhere like that. They took refuge in the Akwesasne community. So cultures who used to not get along that well were actually now helping each other. And so the Sabattis family had roots in Akwesasne too. So the Abenaki name, if I could pronounce it right, it's Akwesasne Nevis. So basically it's Akwesasne Lake. So that's really interesting. And that makes sense, because if you look at the big picture, if you have Paul Smith's here, and here's the St. Lawrence, and there's the community of Akwesasne down there, the river that flows out of our lake would be the highway between the two places. And as you were coming up from here, from Akwesasne, this is the first lake you would hit coming up into the mountains. And then from here, you can branch off in all the watersheds of the uplands. So back then, the rivers were highways. It makes sense. So it's an important thing that we heard Amy mention too, to remember, this is not just ancient history. The folks are still here. They never left, right? So we have a rich Indigenous culture here and a rich Indigenous heritage, including at Paul Smith's College, and we acknowledge that. We have, of course, that we have a First Nations club. We have a Haudenosaunee flag flying in front of the building. We've established a $5,000 scholarship for young folks from Akwesasne or other Indigenous backgrounds to attend Paul Smith's College. And if you have nothing to do next Friday at 12:30, we're going to post a historic marker acknowledging the Indigenous name of our lake on the boat launch on campus. So that's my student, Elliot Sutherland. Okay, so again, Dave sends his regrets, and he really would like to be here. I'm sure a lot of you know Dave, but an amazing person. So he's got a great sense of humor, as you can tell. Massive artistic talent. He's got now taking on the mantle of director of this really important institution. And so I want to share with you what we're doing with this book. And it's a follow-up on that dugout canoe study. We actually published a nerdy scientific technical paper in Adirondack Journal of Environmental Studies about the dugouts and the dating. And then because we were collaborating, we liked working out together, we collaborated on a project that folks at Blue Seed Studio, Carol Lossler and others set up with the Lake Champlain Basin Program, had a grant for combining science and the arts. And the theme was to be watersheds, to help the general public be aware that they live in a water-connected environment, with the hope that then that would help folks send less pollution down rivers into Lake Champlain. So their idea was to team up scientists with artists, but especially have cross-cultural. So the artists were Indigenous folks, and Dave was one of them, and Gudgy Junie Fox was another, and others. So Dave and I teamed up. I gave a little science talk about what a watershed is, what the molecules are, that the pollutants are, what are little algae that are indicators of it, and showed him pictures. And then he went off for months and came up with this. It's called Water is Life. Here's a Giclée copy of it. Please come up afterwards and look really close at it, because it's beautiful as it is. Here's an Indigenous woman holding water in her hands. But if you look really close into the vegetation, it's a mosaic. And it's got diatom algae in there, and nitrate molecules, and other things, as well as Indigenous iconography. And there's even a Star Wars character or two in there as well. So it's humorous, it's beautiful, it's creative, but it's accurate scientifically, because that is what the world is. The world is made of the tiny things, the molecules, the microbial life, the interconnectedness that then, on that scale, becomes what we take for granted as the bigger world. So when I first saw this, again, I got goosebumps for that. So I get emotional looking at it. So anyway, there's a lot of power in this. All right, so we've done this. What's next? Well, some of you may have been aware of, I think it was 3 years ago, there was a podcast, 46. They had a person on there talking about the history of the Adirondacks. And it was like the ghost of Donaldson, only more harsh. Just recently. Here's part of a quote. I'll give you 2 quotes. There's been debate by people who kind of don't know what they're talking about. They say, oh, well, you know, the first settlers were really the Native Americans. That's simply not true. I think they say it mostly for emotional, romantic reasons, because, again, no history supports that. So after a decade of this, we said, okay, it's time for another book. Time for another book. And that's what we're doing together. So it's called the First Adirondackers. We're co-authoring this, 12,000 Years of Indigenous Peoples in the Adirondack Uplands. So now you can tell people, yes, it's in a book. So the theme we've tried to do was Dave's wonderful idea. It has to do with this wampum belt. Wampum is traditional shell beads that are used for documents, for agreements and things like this. This is an agreement with these 2 lines running through it, a purple wampum. They're meant to be paths on a river, with 2 cultures traveling side by side down the river of life. And it's called the 2-row wampum. And it's referring to the earliest Europeans in their sailing ship and Indigenous folks in their canoes traveling side by side, not interfering with each other, keeping a little distance, but still traveling together. And that's the theme we're using in the book of Dave and me. So if you don't mind, what time is it? I'll give you just a little bit of a reading from the introduction. The First Adirondacker is not a comprehensive document. We'll leave that important work to other investigators. References sections at the end of the book, we have that. Nor does it fully represent the ethnic and professional communities we belong to. Rather, it's a way for Dave and me to combine our personal relationships, personal experiences and perspectives in written and visual form to push back against the false claim of absence. To accomplish that, we will employ the same sort of cross-cultural alliance between science and art, mind and heart, that infused the Watershed Project. So then it describes the 2-row wampum tradition. In this spirit, Dave's version of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address precedes this introduction. It's the first thing in the book that you encounter. It precedes my science-based account. Then his traditional account of the origin of the world precedes my science-based account of the origin of the Adirondacks. Both of us present our sections of the book with a full conviction of our own cultural perspectives, but we do so in respectful tandem with one another as fellow Adirondackers. Most of our references of indigenous cultures employ their traditional names, so we'll say Haudenosaunee instead of Iroquois and things like that. Although we make some exceptions for clarity, we also acknowledge the kinship of all living beings that's evidenced by indigenous and scientific knowledge alike by referring to non-humans in the book with terms like she or who rather than it or that. So you'll see these stylistic things going on. So let me just show you, basically each chapter runs through time, going back 12,000 years to the present, and brings us into today. The pattern will be, we'll use Dave's artwork first. This is one of the illustrations. I think actually his dad might have done that one, telling the traditional story of the origin of the world, which was that Sky Woman fell from the sky and landed on the back of a turtle in the great waters. And earth was spread on the back of the turtle grew and became the world. And so it's called Turtle Island, is what we'd be living on. So then there's his chapter telling that, and then I follow up with a scientific version of the origin of the Adirondacks with photos instead of paintings and maps and things. This is by geologist David Franzi. And as we were doing this, I found just amazing parallels. Like, okay, we have Turtle Island, right? Coming up from the water, and then the earth is on there. Doesn't that look like a turtle shell? Big old dome. And what's the geology here? Ocean deposits. The Adirondacks have pushed up through ancient ocean deposits, just like the Great Turtle that we're on. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. So, the power of story is incredible. And when you ally science and the arts, it's just wonderful. So that's what we're doing here. There's photos of taking sediment cores and how we know the story of the park. So then we have a chapter, we skip every 3,000 years. So if I turned it off, yeah, okay. So we have older than the trees, and then another of all the items we have and stories from that. How did people live back then when there was no forest? We start each one with a vignette, like a short story of, imagine you traveling back. And what we've done is pick the same spot for each of the time periods. So it's the point on the campus of Paul Smith's, looking at across the lake where Carrie found the projectile point. You come back year after year. What are the people doing? How are they dressed? How are they making their food? And those kinds of things. And then go into the science of it. So yeah, then there's that one. Then 5,000 years ago, there's St. Regis Mountain. There's St. Regis Mountain. We slow down the time travel as we get closer to the present because we have more information. And it's also maybe a little easier to relate to things where there are crops and pottery and things like that for people too. So it's the use of crops is actually less than 1,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but no, 1,000 years or less to have corn and beans and squash, the Three Sisters. They were brought from Central America. 10 times that history was people being here before anybody grew crops. So whether crops could grow here or not is irrelevant to the story, isn't it? So anyway, we talk about where the crops from and how do they grow them, and then we get into the Great Disruption, which is when European folks showed up, including the probable encounter between Paul Smith himself and the people living on the point there as well. We talk about what were the great land transfers or great land takings. So when a lot of times people will do a land acknowledgement before an event, and they'll say we're on the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee or the Kanietakeron or other people. But you don't think of okay, well, how did that happen in when? Was it taken? Was it sold? What happened? So we tell those stories as well. And we also get into what were some of the original names of the landforms, like Akwesasne Lake and things like that. And then Dave closes the whole book with a chapter about his own personal story and the story of the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center and things going on now. There's an amazing, wonderful cultural renaissance going on, especially in Akwesasne, but other places as well, and he gets into some of that. So wrapping up pretty much here, I want to put in a plug for the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. If you haven't been there, or if you have, it's an amazing place. Here's Dave telling stories around campfire or going out into the woods nearby. In this case, it was with somebody who was a traditional herbalist from Akwesasne, and they were showing the plants that could be used and things like that. So it's a wonderful educational thing and cross-cultural. But there's some incredible things afoot now with them too. Here's the interior of the place. It's just fantastic. The whole thing is top to bottom stuff that Ray Fadden had written out as history, or artifacts and items, or iconography and all kinds of things, right, all over the place. So by now, the building itself is like an artifact worthy of a museum. Well, that's the plan. Here are plans to make a new building with the original building moved and put inside it. Which is incredible. So Dave's hope is to make this a multicultural, science, art, collaborative, two-row kind of a thing, building on the tradition from his father and his grandfather and grandmother and mother, including, you know, an art gallery, because he is an amazing, famous artist, and have the items there as well on display. So if we have any trillionaires, billionaires in the audience here, this is a really, really good cause. So I'd like to leave you with that, and we can open up for questions or comments, and feel free to come up and see her. That's how Dave and I refer to this painting, as her. Oh, I should tell you the amazing story. This is a G clay. It doesn't quite capture the magic of the original, which is a little bit bigger. But Carrie and I have a fun story. We've got the original waiting in our house. We're going to unveil it at some point at the college. Her sister has a little dog who doesn't like people. And it took me a few years for Bella to like me. So
the bacon helped.
The bacon helped. So her sister comes with Bella to visit. And if there's any strangers in the house, Bella's going to start barking. Okay. So it was just us. So we start doing our thing, and then we hear this yipping in the room where the painting is. We walk in, and Bella has her feet on the couch, looking up at her, and going. Fell in love with the painting. Hair rising up on the arms, and yeah, Dave. So we refer to it as her. So thank you very much. Books coming out first week of December.
Do you need a pre-order, or are there?
I always encourage people to buy it from local booksellers. So we have the small bookstore down here. There's Bookstore Plus in Lake Placid. You can order it on Amazon as well.
Please don't.
But please don't.
Book Nook, Bookstore Plus.
Bookstore Plus.
Those are your people.
Yep.
Curt, thank you so much. And I think the number of people in the room really shows how much your work and Dave's work means to those of us who are living here today. And the work that you have done really restores dignity to, oh, you're gonna make me cry. It restores dignity to thousands of years of humans who lived here and loved it the way that we do. And I want to talk, without putting you too much on the spot, I want to talk about the ramifications for our society when we start to respect and recognize the dignity of those people. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we're at a really tough time in our cultural history right now, right? There's a lot of anger and pain and divisiveness. I found that most people don't want that. And if you're careful how you present this, instead of saying, you know, good and bad and blaming and this stuff, instead you say, look at this amazing story of our fellow Adirondackers. you're basically acknowledging our family and being inclusive in your family. And then you automatically want to treat them with respect, and you're proud of them. I'm proud of this heritage and that I live in the Adirondacks. And so far, at least of the people who agree that there really were people here, are proud of this too. And some of you are aware, we've also done this kind of work with the African American history here. And again, the only people I've heard talking against it aren't from here. Right? There's a pride in saying these are part of who we are. One way I try to describe it is the human story of the Adirondacks is like a beautiful tapestry of many colors and threads. And what we've been having to be satisfied with so far was just a few tattered white threads. But they're long and they're multicolored, and it's wonderful. So I think that's the way it works, and there you go.
Alright, this one might be asking a good judgment over here.
It's wonderful, Kurt. I have two questions. One is like, I've read, I'm not super knowledgeable about this, but a lot of early Swedish explorers, scientists took a lot of artifacts from here and students. So does, those appear in your book? Did you draw your research from those things? And the second thing is like, what do you think about the historical import of telling these stories, because, history kind of repeats and rhymes itself, and especially now, that funded by us, like indigenous people are being cleansed at another part of the world, and so what do you think like this would tell to that?
Yeah. So I was just thinking of your last part. What was your first part? I already forgot it. Sorry, Psychot. What was the first thing Psychot said?
Swedish artifacts.
Oh, the artifacts, yes, okay. Will you talk about that general topic? What do you do with artifacts? What's legal? What's ethical? And things like that. So in terms of legality, if items are found on private property, you're allowed to take them. If it's on state property, you're not. So, okay, well, I used to live in Denmark. If there was like a national heritage item on your property, well, tough noogies, it's your property. This is our heritage, and so it ends up in a museum, In theory, if the Mona Lisa had been painted here and it was buried in a vault on someone's property, they could dig it up and burn it or sell it. Right? So our law does not protect that, but that's the way it is. So all of the items here are in the New York State Museum or the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center, or the Adirondack Experience has some as well. So there will be discussions about repatriation. Some are at the Cultural Center in Akwesasne. The big dugout canoe that's 500 years old, the new owners intend to donate that to the museum, Six Nations. As far as the erasure of culture and genocide going on around the world, yes, absolutely, it's relevant to that. We didn't delve deeply into it because we have enough stories to tell about our own place here. But my sense is, at least globally, our species seems to be evolving enough to realize that that's wrong. And there's a lot of cultural pride around the world in a lot of cultures too. There's a lot of networking. I know there have been delegations from Akwesasne joining with traditional folks in Australia and other places as well for unity and standing together and taking pride. And there are even, as far as climate change and environmental stewardship goes, there's a whole cultural movement I know from the Amazon. They call it Pachamama, if you've heard of that, Mother Earth. It's indigenous folks trying to teach us about care for the earth with their traditional views. They are like missionaries coming here to us backward people. Right? So yeah, it's a complicated world. And we have the blessing and the curse of being able to learn about it with our social media and everything.
So I can bring findings up to this summer. I had a camp on Upper Saranac Lake, and one of my neighbors hard for everybody to see, but if you see this stone, and just by example, he attached it to a piece of wood, just because it was used as a hammer. So he took it up and spoke with Dave Fadden, which I wish he was here because I wasn't part of that conversation. But it's a tool. So anyway,
There you go. Another dot on the map.
there you go.
I'll never make it back though.
Good to hear that indigenous tribes follow their melting ice and populate those areas that become uncovered. A couple of questions though. One, the flint arrowheads, the pottery, there's no flint in the Adirondack, so they had to come from elsewhere. Pottery, there's no clay soils to make pottery, so they came from elsewhere from the Adirondack. So I have yet to hear concrete evidence of wintering over in Adirondack. You may say, well, the Eskimos live up in the north, but my pops in my head is, well, those areas are in precipitation deserts. They don't get that much snow. Adirondacks get feet of snow, so much different here to overwinter than I would say for the Eskimos live over. So my question is, do you have any hard evidence, sleds, snowshoes, or something that they wintered over, and any evidence of any settlements you found?
Thank you, you've set me up beautifully. There was actually a slide of an eyewitness description of people camping up here in the winter. They came up for hunting. And that captive was with them in the 1600s. Isaac Joe, described the situation there. So it was a common thing at the time to come up, and they're guessing locale was probably around the Saranac Lakes, where that was. Indigenous people invented snowshoes. So really, without getting into too much detail, there would not be long-term, hard settlements because that was not the lifestyle. You're a hunter-gatherer, you move, you go, the berries are here, then the shad are running on the river there, the caribou are coming up in to have their calves on the melting snow on the mountains at this time of year, and so this entire region. There are eyewitnesses accounts of that. Really, if you boil it down, the burden of proof is not on hard evidence that they were here. It's hard evidence that they were not here. Because we know people lived in the Rocky Mountains. We know people lived in the Appalachians. We know people lived in New England, in the greens and the whites. It's just that there's a lack of evidence here. So all the resources were here. People knew how to live here. People lived in much colder environments. Snow actually helps you travel across country in the winter. So it helps level out the snow. It slows the moose down, so you can hunt them on your snowshoes, things like that. The freezing of the lakes and the streams make highways. So there is so much here. It boggles the mind to think of why they would. And we do have the evidence of people being here a long time through multiple cultural phases in which people were known to live in these kinds of habitats. So yes, there will never be a snowshoe found that's 5,000 years old because they rot. So really, I'm just gonna throw the challenge back at this point with all of this other evidence and say if someone doesn't think they were here in the winter, prove it. And why would it matter if they weren't right here in the winter? If they're here most of the rest of the year, they still live here. Do the loons live in the Adirondacks? The loons aren't here in the winter, but we say they live here, right? So it's the bigger question is, how do we decide what it means to live somewhere and how, right? Let's see, one Other thing about the snow, oh yeah, it's actually, when winter comes, where would you rather be? Here in the mountains with the snow, or down in St. Lawrence County with howling wind blasting across the lowlands, freezing your eyeballs off. You can have shelter here. So I think you come up here partly for the hunting, and there's always fish in the streams. It was harsh everywhere, but they knew how to do it. They were resourceful. So I may have dodged your question a little bit, but I think I turned it into a challenge. One part you want to.
Well, I just wanted to point out the obvious that, you know, the history of European settlement here has turned the Adirondacks into an enhanced landscape, waterscape with dammed rivers and, you know, dams everywhere that raise the water level. From an archaeological vantage point, given that we've just passed through a very dry summer in which a lot of lakes, whether dammed or not, have dropped a number of feet, was there any kind of push to kind of explore the lake shores?
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought of, because of the Tupper Lake thing, that's how they saw it. The amount that the lakes went down this summer was not comparable to what happened with Tupper. But yeah, I was like, oh my gosh, we gotta look. All right, so most of the lakes with the dams on them didn't drop that much. So I was so disappointed, like, oh, I'm going to Tupper, I'm going to, and I'm looking, wait a minute, it looks the same as always. St. Regis looked the same all the way through. So the dams totally have everything buried. The other thing is, as dry as this was, Carrie and I checked this out. We thought, okay, our real rain gauge here for us personally is Bear Pond. You know that in the St. Regis canoe area. There was a little island there with a tree on it, and it's submerged. You know, and there was a swimming rock. Some of you may have swum on that. It was a little bit above water level. So we said, oh, let's go check it out. Bear Pond will tell us how dry this is. Can you see the island? Can you see the swimming rock? You can just see the tip of the island. And the swimming rock is still submerged. So this drought we have is not even comparable to what normal was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Show you how much the climate has changed. It's been getting wetter on average, mostly. So yeah, we didn't find anything great. But the best thing is, if anybody knows of a dam being pulled out for repairs or something on a lake, please let us know, and we'll go and look. Thing is, now there's been so much, we did the Cary Falls Reservoir. It's just, there's so much sediment now, everything's pretty much buried, which means it's safe. But we won't be losing it anytime soon. Maybe one more?
I know that after the ice sheets receded, there was a lot of glacial lakes holding water back. Do you know, first of all, do we know exactly where the shoreline was of those glacial lakes? And second of all, would you be able to walk along that to find where some of those 12,000-year-old artifacts are?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's great archaeological sleuthing you've got there. That's how they do it. So people have mapped out, let's say, Lake Champlain, the old beach stands from the high stands, and that's where you find the paleo sites all along there. It makes sense. People wanted the high ground so you could look far and see where the caribou are, or people you didn't like coming, or any of that kind of stuff. So we can assume that the same thing was here. And in fact, that point on Lower St. Regis Lake is just such a place. If you remove all the trees, you'd have the same kind of landscape, high ground looking over the whole area right there, and then there's that paleo projectile point. So one thing, it's harder to do it in the Adirondacks. There's trees everywhere. We don't have excavations like you do in the low country. You're not digging up lots of roads, all that kind of stuff, and a lot of it's state land. and you can't do it. So that's another problem of, why it's easy to think people didn't live here, because we don't have as much evidence. Most of the archaeology is done in lower elevations where there were villages about 500 years ago and things, and they focus on that because they get the most stuff that they find. But around here, one thing I want to find, which would not have any problem of people looting it, because it would be too big, is a caribou fence. I'm going to flip back here to the image of people hunting the caribou, what Dave painted. Where was it? Did I get it yet? No, I think it's coming up. It's up. No, I didn't do it. Oh, I know. It's earlier. Forget that. It's hard to sneak up on a caribou. So what do? You scare them. You work together as a group, men, women, and children, and maybe your dogs, and you sneak up on them, downwind of them. You scare them, and they run. Meanwhile, you've built a stone fence in the path where you're going to drive them to. They run and run and run, come to the fence, they hit the fence and start going sideways, and then there's a gap in the fence and hunters are waiting right there. Archaeologists found one of those underneath Lake Huron. I think it is Lake Huron. They were doing geological surveys with radar at the bottom, and they said, what are these lines doing down there? And it turns out, you can even tell by the orientation, it was to get the caribou on their way north, I think it was, or south in their migration. So that's how you do it. Everybody works together. You got your darts and stuff, so those could still be sitting up here. And this kind of a habitat is just right for the caribou hunting. We know caribou were in upstate New York for a long time. It makes sense that they would be here because they were everywhere else. And what traditionally would happen is the cows would bring the calves up in the spring to the melting snowbanks and either have the calves there or bring the calves up, and they would rest because the cold air on the snow would keep the flies down, the bot flies and everything like that, and the mosquitoes, and they would rest there. And so it was traditional for folks to hunt them. And there are, now that the ice is melting around the world, in the Yukon, up in the mountains there, the ice and the snow is melting away, and there is like layer upon layer of brown snow. It's caribou poo with atlatl darts, the fletching still intact, and the atlatls themselves all there mingled in from that style of hunting. It's unimaginable, to me at least, that it didn't happen here too. Why not? Caribou would have been here. So how do we get on that? Oh yeah, that's something you could find. So LiDAR. Or if you're up in the mountains and you see a long line of boulders, let me know. So thank you so much, and I'm just so proud to be part of this community. I think, and especially Saranac Lake, but just here we are with our fellow Adirondackers celebrating our rich heritage.